Hi there. In today's video, I'll be discussing some notes I've been working on regarding operating in an urban environment. And hopefully the background noise won't be too distracting, but it's such a nice day out, I thought I would shoot this video outside. In episode 22, I mentioned some thoughts on operating in desert conditions. And today's content's kind of a continuation of that regarding operating in certain environments. I plan on doing 2 more videos on this topic, and the next one will be on woodland settings, and the final one on this topic will be about operating in winter conditions. So a question I hear people new to radio often ask is, how far can I talk? And my response is usually, it depends. And I know sometimes people get annoyed with that answer because you probably hear it a lot from other people, but how far you can talk really does depend on a few factors, such as what kind of antenna you have, how high up in elevation you are, how much power does your radio have, as well as what obstructions are in your way. And those obstructions could be either, buildings, houses, vegetation. And another question is, if you're operating in an urban environment, which band is better, UHF or VHF? And I'll get into some of the pros and cons of both here in a second, but both of them work using line of sight. However, if there's an obstruction between you and the radio you're attempting to communicate with, such as a mountain, then that's where repeaters are useful. But unless you have access to a repeater in the area you're operating in, your communications are likely going to be simplex, meaning radio to radio. In urban environments, you may find the UHF band being used in places like construction sites, hotels, retail stores, warehouses, fast food places, as well as many other retail establishments. The reason many of these places use the UHF band is because it's favorable in urban environments where there's a lot of obstructions like buildings, houses, and other structures. The UHF band tends to have, better performance than that of VHF in this type of setting because the UHF wavelength is shorter, and that generally allows for better penetration of the type of obstructions I mentioned that you would find in an urban setting. Of course, since both bands are line of sight, anything that gets in the way, whether you're on UHF or VHF, will weaken the signal to some extent, and that can include other obstructions like trees and vegetation, which I mentioned a moment ago. So determining which band to use is dependent on factors like your geography and, generally the area you're going to be operating in. And the differences in wavelength are an important factor to consider when deciding to use either UHF or VHF. Some examples of frequencies on the UHF band would be the family radio service or the general mobile radio service. And again, those are frequencies that have shorter wavelengths, and it's part of the UHF band. The shorter wavelength generally can pass easily through doors, windows, penetrate walls, and in some cases concrete, which is useful in an urban area. The downside of this band is your transmission may not travel as far compared to that of VHF. And so when comparing the 2 bands in an urban environment, VHF is generally not as effective as UHF. However, VHF wavelengths are longer than UHF, and an example of some VHF frequencies you might find would be the multi-use radio service, also called MERS, and you can use those frequencies without a license, just like you can the family radio service or FRS. VHF transmissions can travel over longer distances, and while VHF wavelengths can also penetrate structures, UHF, I would say, is still more effective in an urban setting. However, VHF is a good choice for rural or some wooded areas. And compared to UHF, the reason that it's VHF is favorable in rural or wooded areas is because of the longer wavelength, and it can cover longer distances. So if you're in an area that has a lot of hills, then you also might find that VHF transmissions might be reflected a little bit better than UHF over that type of terrain, and will probably provide a little bit better performance than UHF. So, as I mentioned, in an urban environment, one of the problems you may encounter are all the obstacles in the form of buildings or other structures that obscure transmission paths. And you also might find that there's a lack of electrical conductivity due to some of the concrete and paved surfaces. And another thing to note, I guess, is an urban environment is also a very busy one. You know, there's a lot of different electrical signals from the surrounding utility lines, and that can also cause some interference. So if you're out in a neighborhood or walking around in a city with a handheld transceiver, there are some conditions that you may run into, and I'll mention some that I've experienced before I wrap this video up. But if you're in a suburban neighborhood like where I'm at right now, I would say on average, if you're using an HT with a stock antenna and you have the power set to high, your range is probably a mile or less. In a dense city, I've had similar results where sometimes from radio to radio, you know, I can get up to a mile or just a few city blocks. And, you know, your experience is it's gonna vary, you know, depending on what kind of environment you're in. But overall, I would say UHF is probably the better band to use if you're in a urban environment. Anyway, I hope this video was helpful, and that's all for now. Thank you for watching.